Welcome to the 16th and final video in the series, The Dictatorship of the Proletariat According to Marx and Engels. Today we'll be going over the 1884 piece by Engels, Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, Part 9, Barbarism and Civilization, which I have subtitled New Society Emerges, State Machinery Transformed Radically. As the productive forces develop, if the relations of production are out of sync with those forces and lack the ability to be brought into harmony with them, due to some sort of conservative force, like a ruling class aiming to maintain relations materially beneficial to them and their existence, there will be continual upheavals created by the productive forces outstripping old relations. In the face of this, the ruling class of any era will attempt to adapt the old social order to fit those new conditions, either by force via the state, or by modulating its own activity spontaneously through various methods of suppressing contradictions in the mode of production. In the case of the bourgeois one, the creation of new markets, new wants, new desires. The conquest of international markets as national markets become too saturated and the organic composition of capital increases beyond what is profitable. The expansion of the reserve army of labor, the creative destruction of capital and labor, and so on. However, all of these are fundamentally temporary measures, ones which are incapable of truly uprooting the root contradiction between labor and capital. Eventually, these produce general crises, each more violent than the last and requiring ever more active repression of contradiction, wherein the whole of the mode of production circuit enters into a seizure. It becomes incapable of producing, which is the basis of any material existence, the ability to reproduce itself on a daily basis. With the mode of production incapable of reproducing itself and the whole society thrown into chaos, new forms of productive relations must arise. With the development of the productive forces, more and more of the current relations become obsolete, while new relations become not only viable, but increasingly viable, with our level of development and which operate outside the violent upheavals of the old society. So, as an example of this, right? During a depression, in order to make it so that people can feed themselves, what do they do? Well, they set up mutual aid organizations. They build unions. They build cooperatives. They build all sorts of different formats in order that operate external to the contradiction between labor and capital as best as possible. And the bourgeois society continually represses and attacks these things. It must do so because these things are outside of itself. These things are the foundation for the development of the dictatorship of the proletariat. These organizations that exist outside of that as a form of dual power. And we'll talk more about that within the series on foundations of communist organizing. So, continuing. Eventually, these new relations, boiling up beneath the repressions of the old relations of production and their forces united against the rising class relations, use their power within the mode of production as a rising class in order to assert their class interests against their oppressors. Class struggle acts as the engine, and revolution as the locomotive of history. Society reaches a new computational step as the social order is violently rearranged in favor of new relations more closely synchronized with the productive forces, and wields them in a manner far more effective than the previous relations could ever have. All of society is reborn in line with the new mode of production, made up of both the relations and forces. It is for this reason that capital will be eventually defeated by labor, and the proletariat, as a rising class, will establish its own forces of coercive power, a state, to preside over this upheaval in their own favor. The traditional state itself is emergent from the materially irreconcilable contradictions in society in the form of class antagonisms, which requires the ruling class of any given era to exercise violent, coercive force upon the subjected classes. Historically, in previous modes of production where the ruling class is in the minority, the state must take on an appearance of standing above society as a mediator between classes and their conflicts, moderating the conflict and keeping it within the boundaries of quote-unquote order, while alienating itself from society it arises out of, despite being in service to the ruling class at any time. And I don't think I have to note that the boundaries of order are dictated by the ruling class's interests. The ruling class in this relation establishes what constitutes as order. I had that written here. And forces class conflict to be on the terrain of the state wherever possible. In comparison, while the proletariat will create their own state to complete out the social revolutions, its own state will be fundamentally distinct to all previous ones, owing to the proletariat being in the majority. The state, this alienated form of social power, which pretends at being external to society, will instead have its social power reabsorbed by society, and those powers stripped of their characteristics of both being moderation and having coercive power in the act of this reabsorption. This stripping of powers occurs only as irreconcilable class antagonisms come to an end. The traditional state establishes itself on a territorial basis and forces itself as a dominant compared to other social relations which compete with it, such as a family and direct organizing by all classes other than the ruling class. In comparison, rather than holding itself on a territorial basis, the dictatorship will produce the world republic, the direct organizing by the whole of the people which knows no borders besides that which is geographically, materially emplaced. The traditional state establishes a public force that is distinct from the people's own organization of themselves as an armed power, granting special rights to carry out the will of the state on behalf of the ruling class. This coercive force is required to maintain class relations on behalf of a minority. In comparison, the dictatorship which carries out the reabsorption of social power, whereby the majority are in the absolute rule, abolishes these special armed bodies. Instead, the people spontaneously take up arms and militias to protect their interests. The traditional state apparatus extracts taxes in order to maintain public power, distinct from socially pooled resources to support material reproduction of society, in such a way that is supportive to the ruling class and further repress the subjective. In comparison, the dictatorship minimizes taxation and accrues funds to the expropriation of the expropriators, and all funds are placed solely at the interest of placing public power directly in the hands of the proletariat, while developing towards socialism. Social organization of the proceeds of social production occurs externally to this. Public power is reabsorbed and the right of taxation ended. In addition, officials are placed fully in the midst of society and their bureaucratic positions are converted to robust, clear positions in the technical hierarchy of functions without any special rights or mysticism. This new state machinery will lead to a new society, and it carries out this birth in a distinct way from all previous states. Thus, it is not even necessarily correct to even call it a state, besides that it carries out the coercive force of class domination. And that is my summary of the final piece in the series, The Dictatorship of the Proletariat according to Marx and Engels. Engels' Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, Part 9, Barbarism and Civilization. Well, it's been quite the ride, hasn't it? We've gone through the character of the communism of production, now the dictatorship of the proletariat. Next up will be the foundations of communist organizing, and this series will be significantly longer. It is based primarily on the ICP, that is the Italian left communists of the Borghist tradition stuff. I work in a couple of other things and I have critiques that start making their way into them more and more over time. In addition, look forward to those PowerPoints eventually coming out. It will be a long series of a variety of different things that take all the information from this and any other source that I'm aware of that I have in mind and put it into a series of PowerPoints that situates these things in different sections rather than, piece after piece after piece. No, it's going to be, we're talking about this topic as regards the dictatorship of the proletariat. In addition, wherever possible within these PowerPoints, I will do my best to concretize things. Say, for example, talk about what spaces of living might look like in communist society, or what exactly will necessarily be involved in planning, what kind of organizations constitute as dual power, and how and essentially how people organize within those things. A lot of these will be looking in from the outside. I'm afraid I am not part of a worker cooperative or anything along those lines. I don't actually really know how these things work, but I'll do the best that I can to try and express at least the kind of feeling that should be involved in that. So, thank you for joining me for this series and the previous one, and I hope that you will join me for the next one, which will, the preface and format 2 will come out tomorrow. Anyway, have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you then.